I think the Asia House Biography Foundation Literature Festival is really important for writers like me, and actually stories like this. There are not many books out there that kind of deal with sort of the splicing of identities, or the kind of mixing of identities between, my upbringing, which was kind of North London, and being Asian in North London at a very particular moment in time. And then the subject of my book, who's Hassan Butt, who's also Muslim in Manchester. And people don't realise, they think, oh, okay, everyone's sort of from an Asian background, like in the UK, it's all the same rough thing, isn't it? And actually it's completely different. I kind of lived in this very, my parents were pretty educated. They're from India, they're Hindu, for different sort of almost immigrant path to this country. And being pretty well educated, I think they were able to, on my behalf, understand a lot of the sort of identity issues that I had when I was growing up, which I think landed me in a much more interesting, safer, more prosperous sort of place than the subject of the book, Hassan Butt, who ended up actually in the arms of Islamists, and that was a lot to do with identity for him. So yes, festivals like this are massively important. Hassan Butt's a fascinating character. We met in 2005 because I was working for the BBC at the time, just working on a project trying to understand the July 7th bombings. And he had been a very vocal person in the kind of Islamist jihadist scene. He'd been out in Pakistan, there's no sort of doubt about that, hanging out with people who he was filmed with, who ended up later in jail or dead, all sort of terrorists in essence. And he was actually, at that point when I met him, I think The Sun labelled him as the sort of top 5 most hated jihadist in the UK. So he was a well-known figure in that respect, and trying to figure out who he was, And then we endeavoured to sort of write a book about his life, because he wanted to move away from being this jihadi. And why he did that, I still don't know. I think, being an investigative journalist means going after hard stories. It means being obsessive. And there's a problem with that, which is that sometimes you're obsessive over the wrong thing. Every investigative journalist has that one story that they just keep working away on, which if, they told their editor that, I've been working on this for 10 years, it'd be massively embarrassing. And, but you just keep going. And sometimes that lands you in the wrong place. More often than not, it's a good thing. But in this case, I think I got very obsessed about who he was, desperately trying to find out what the real facts of this were. But in the end, I got a book out of it, which is what I wanted. And I hope I've put some of those demons to rest. Oh, there'd just be a welter of things that I'd have done differently. I started this book 13 years ago, in essence. And it is a very different book. I set out to write his autobiography. It all fell apart. If you read the book, also, you'll find out why. I had to then write a sort of a reconfigured, retransformed book out of it all to try and tell a book about a book, in essence, which obviously everyone hates, that kind of a thing, but that kind of a conceit. But in this case, obviously, it's sort of, I think it ends up being sort of quite a thrilling thing. So, but I started this when I was really young. I think I was 25, 26, and I was naive. But the great thing about it is I had made so many mistakes that I ended up being a much better journalist for it. So you'll find out at the end of the book, I can give this away, I think, that he ended up in prison for sentenced to 13 years for fraud. There hasn't been any update since that point. And I'm wondering really actually how he's doing in jail. There's some thought that I could somehow visit him, but I haven't yet entertained that yet enough. So I'm still working on this story in one form or another, which is awful to think about in many ways. But I interviewed Hassan for his book, and I had hours and hours of tapes. And we're now in an era, when I started the book, there was no such thing as a podcast. We're now in an era where podcasts are all the rage. And so we've just finished, as of yesterday, as we're recording this, the final edits for an 8-part series on this.